What's up, YouTube? Today I'm going to be putting in some new springs into my son's car. We are putting in 3/4 ton. Where he's got his springs right now, the car sits too low, and when he drops it all the way, the cross member on the frame, it hits the ground pretty hard. So we got some 3/4 ton springs that are going back in it, the white springs, and I'm going to cut them down to make it sit in the right height that he kind of wants. Now, one thing to note is that we are actually going to be cutting it about, let's just call it about 2 inches higher than what he wants it to sit at. And the reason is because springs, they do settle in, they do compress, and they do settle where they're a little bit shorter. So you don't want to cut springs right away to the exact height of where you want the car to sit, because eventually it's going to slowly drop just a little bit more. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And I'm going to be showing you how you can take it out the easy way, and then depending on the size of your spring and how much you're putting in there, kind of not necessarily the hard way, but unfortunately the taller the spring, the more work sometimes you have to do in order to do that. So that's what I'm going to be going over today. It's on a 95 Fleetwood, Cadillac Fleetwood. So first thing I'm going to be doing, since this car sits so low, is I'm going to lift it up a little bit just so I can get the jack under it. Alright, so first I'm going to jack it up, and I'm going to put some jack stands underneath it. Then I'm going to take the jack, and while my son is helping me, I'm going to jack up underneath the lower arm. I'm going to jack it up and then have him dump the rest of the fluid out of the cylinder to compress the cylinder all the way before starting to try to pull the springs and everything out. Now right now his springs are about, let's call it a half stack, almost the size of like a pre-cut or like the blue springs. So we're going to go ahead and we'll try to yank them out without having to take everything apart, and you can do that. Now once we go to put in his taller springs is when I believe I'm going to have to tear everything apart, break apart ball joints and things like that. So that's where we are right now. So before I get started on this side, I'm gonna go ahead and detach the chains. If you don't have chains, you probably should. And the chains from your lower arm to your frame are to keep it to where if your ball joint breaks, your wheel doesn't pop off, or excuse me, the arm doesn't break off and flies up underneath there like y'all have seen in some of the lowrider problem type of videos. So I'm going to take these chains off first, and in addition to that, a lot of times you'll find that your cup has literally wedged itself in to the spring. So you want to take something and pry it apart and break it apart first before you get started. All right, unfortunately the cup has gotten stuck in the spring, so I'm gonna have to break this loose. Just gonna stick something in here and pry it apart. All right, so when you do this, make sure that you're holding the cylinder at the top. Make sure that it is up as high as possible and held still, even if you got to grab somebody else to hold it up. You also, when you go to pull the spring down, the cylinder may try to do this where it's holding on and just attaching itself, and the cylinder itself is expanding. So you're gonna have to get it broken apart like that, and then push your cylinder back up in there some kind of way, which I guess in this situation I'm just going to do it by hand. All right, so now that's pushed all the way in. So now your spring should just be kind of flopping around in there. So I'm going to take and push it up and slide it out. as you can tell the difference between the two, this right here, I used this as a guide the first time when we cut the springs. Well, as you can see where this is versus where this is in the same basic spot, you see how much these springs have compressed. That's dropped at least an inch. At least an inch. So if I cut it in the same spot right now, it would appear that this spring is taller than this one, but it's actually not, because by the time it compresses, it's going to come down. So what we're probably going to do, we're trying to give about a little more than 2 inches of lift, lift it up about 2 inches. So we're probably going to cut it right somewhere in there. Let's just say somewhere in there. Might even go a little bit higher, just because we know we can cut off more later on. I normally go based off of half coils. So if instead of right here, I might turn it around and cut it somewhere right in here, something like that. All right, so I've decided to cut it right about here. We can leave more and cut later. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut right here. So it'll give it time to drop and settle in wherever it's going to settle. So now this coil was in the way, and which is something you'll run into when cutting these things. Another coil will be in your way, so I went ahead and cut it and got it out of the way, and then I'm going to cut it right there. So here is a cool video on how I am cutting it slow. Now what you also want to remember is you don't want to use a torch on these, because when you heat up springs, they will continue to compress. So the easiest way is to use a angle cutting wheel to do so. And that is called hot crotch cutting. All right, so I got my cylinder held up, and the chain is off. Inside of here, you've got your pin. You need to take your pin right here. You need to take your pin out. So take your pin out, slide it out, and then you're going to take this nut right here off. After you take that nut off, I'll show you what to do next. Okay, so I've removed the pin and I've removed the nut, and now it is time to take your pickle fork and get between the, I guess this would be the spindle and the actual ball joint. And you want to bang the shit out of it. All right, so now I'm gonna take the jack. Now, while I've been doing all this, I guess I should have mentioned this, is that I've had the jack up underneath it the entire time to make sure that when I broke the ball joint loose, it didn't just come crashing down. So I've had a jack under it, not like jacked up the car or anything, but just supporting the weight. So now I'm gonna drop it. And as you can see, I see that the bolt out of the bottom of the cylinder has come out at some point, so I'm gonna find one and put that back in. All right, so now you're ready for the next springs to put the springs back in. Okay, so now that I have aligned the cup to go into the spring, where that as soon as I drop the car or lift the jack, it will kind of lock it into place. It'll kind of slide into place. I have twisted the spring around to where I am satisfied with where it is. And now I am just putting everything back together. So the first thing, I'm gonna push the spindle back, move this brake line, put the arm and ball joint to where it is supposed to be. Then I'm gonna jack it up a little bit and try and get it to line up. kind of pushed it into place, which I'm probably going to relocate this dude right here. That shouldn't be right there. Anyway, so you moved it, and now you want to replace your bolt. And after your bolt, you're going to slide your pin back in and lock it into place, or twist it around or bend it out once you've shoved it into place. I'm also going to obviously put my chain back in and call it a day. I'm gonna drop the car and see where she sits at. Got it all back together. It's roughly 2 inches higher than where we want it to end up at after the spring has finished settling. There are some manufacturers out there that will say that they are pre-compressed, and I disagree. I've never seen a spring that didn't at least settle some and drop a little bit further. So I do suggest at least 1 to 2 inches higher than where you want it to end up at. Leave it in there for about a solid month to give everything plenty of time to continue to drop where it's going to. Make sure that you subscribe and go to Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, Tennessee on Hydraulics. Follow us on all of those. Doesn't cost you a thing, but it does help us make more videos, so make sure that you're following.